Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're super happy that you've joined us for the pre-COP28 media briefing for African journalists on how a fossil fuel treaty can support a just energy transition in Africa. My name is Sebla Samuel, and I'm the head of Africa Campaigns and Advocacy for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I'm joining you from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia today. We have three amazing speakers for you. We have Omar El-Mawi, who is the Africa Movement of Movements co-convener. We have Lorraine Chiponda, who is the Don't Gas Africa co-facilitator and the Africa Movement of Movements facilitator, and Dean Bebe, who is the campaigns lead for PowerShift Africa. And we're going to dig into the key moments on climate and energy for our continent in the lead up to COP28. The fallacies that are pushed by the fossil fuel industry that falsely present coal, oil, and gas as the only pathway to development for Africa, despite leaving 600 million people in the dark, and how international cooperation through a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty can actually break this perverse cycle and allow Africa to achieve its renewable energy potential and meet the continent's development needs. And as the media, you all have an important role in playing to spread this vital message. So before we get into the conversations with our speakers, I'm going to give a brief overview of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, its reason for being, and why it's important for Africa. And then we can dig into the conversation with our speakers. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to put them in the chat. And my superstar teammate, Viviana, who is our communications campaign manager, will be able to answer you. And if you have any questions that are directed for a specific speaker, you can just put that also in the chat, because we'll have an extra 10 minutes at the end for any interactions and questions you want to have. And I also want to thank Zoe, our tech manager, for being here and making this all possible. So I am going to share my screen really quickly so you can get a little intro to the Fossil Fuel Treaty if you don't know it already. Is it possible to share my screen, Zoe?
Yes, you should be able to.
It says it's disabled. Participant screen sharing.
It should be working now.
Okay, great. Yeah, it is. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the Fossil Fuel Treaty the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is a global initiative to address the source of the climate crisis from the root, which is fossil fuels, because coal, oil, and gas are responsible for 86% of carbon emissions released in the last decade. Despite being the primary cause of the climate crisis, they are completely absent from the Paris Agreement, which is currently the world's most important climate accord. We find it very dangerous for the leading cause of the climate crisis to be absent in the leading climate negotiation. We wonder, how can we actually tackle this crisis if we're not going to the source? And so we see the Fossil Fuel Treaty as a complementary mechanism to the Paris Agreement that focuses on winding down the supply and production of fossil fuels in line with the Paris Agreement, to complement the Paris Agreement's focus on reducing emissions and reducing demand for fossil fuels. And we use the provocative metaphor of fossil fuels as weapons of mass destruction because they are the leading cause of the climate crisis that we are trying to overcome collectively today. And this is from the Just Out Production Gap Report. And basically what it shows is how much countries actually have to be reducing their production of fossil fuels compared to what is actually happening. Countries are on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels between now and 2030 than what can be safely burned to limit warming to not go above 1.5 degrees. The reason this massive overshoot is currently taking place is because there is no international mechanism to actually ensure a phase out of fossil fuels. We are managing the emissions and managing demand for fossil fuels. There is no international mechanism to manage the decline of fossil fuels production, and that's what we're proposing at the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And this is from our allies at Oil Change International that show it's also not enough to stop expansion of new fossil fuel projects in the world. The currently operating coal, oil, and gas projects already overshoot our carbon budget and our chance at 1.5 degrees. And despite all the work that there's been in increasing investment in renewable energy, there actually has not been much of a shift in fossil fuels as a part of the global energy mix in the past decade. Fossil fuels still make up around 80% of our global energy mix. And so we know we need an international mechanism to wind this down and actually create a new era of renewable energy for all. And so what happens if there is no global agreement on fossil fuels? Every single supplier, every BP, every Chevron, every Exxon, every Shell, every Eni is going to want to squeeze out the very last drop. It will make the transition that is necessary to renewable energy inevitably way more difficult. We risk so much financial turmoil and stranded assets, pouring money into projects and infrastructure that actually don't have a lifeline. We do not want to see fossil fuel projects online by mid-century. Poses risks to workers and communities that are dependent on the fossil fuel industry for their incomes. It puts them in very precarious situations when they could actually be getting support and training to be part of the renewable energy economy. It delays the expansion of renewable energy because disproportionate amount of funding is going towards fossil fuels instead of renewable energy today. And it also delays economic diversification. There's countries that have monopolies on fossil fuel production that make them very vulnerable to economic shifts. And what they need is development alternatives and other pathways for income. So you can see what happens if there's no sort of global instrument managing and governing a fossil fuel production phase out. Why is international cooperation necessary? Because countries are not equally responsible for the crisis that we're facing today. If we want to think about African countries, we think about Nigeria, Angola, Congo. You can see here between 40 to 60% of their national revenue comes from oil, as an example. But you could think about gas, you could think about coal, you could think about percentages of employment that comes from fossil fuel sectors. Different countries' economies are entwined with the fossil fuel industry, but they're not all equally responsible. You can see countries on the vertical axis like Canada, like the US, like the UK and Norway, whose public rhetoric and political discourse talks about how much their economies are bound up with fossil fuels and how they could never transition away, when actually you see their economies are much more diversified. They have very high GDPs per capita, and they're the ones that have put Africa in this mess. So these kind of countries like Canada, the UK, Norway, etc., the US need to phase out their fossil fuel production first and fastest and give financial and technical support to countries like Nigeria, Angola, and Congo who need that capacity to be able to transition to a renewable energy era in their countries. So what have fossil fuels meant for our continent? There's been decades of coal, oil, and gas extraction on the continent. And like I said before, there's 600 million people without power despite all of this fossil fuel extraction. Sub-Saharan Africa is home to 75% of the world's population that is living without electricity. Fossil fuels are not going to be able to deliver electricity access to the 80% of rural Africans who currently don't have access. What they need is distributed off-grid or microgrid supplies of renewable energy and networks of renewable energy. Currently, the majority of fossil fuel production is destined for export to foreign markets, so we're not even fulfilling our own energy access. And the fossil fuel production is dominated by foreign ownership. It's driving both our climate and our economies to collapse. I said almost 90% of the carbon emissions released in the past decade come from coal, oil, and gas, and are disproportionately affecting Africa as a continent that has only contributed 3% of cumulative emissions. The African Development Bank says that every year between 5 to 15% of the GDP growth is lost to climate change impacts. Current financing is disproportionately directed towards fossil fuels. 4 times more from the G20 came in the past years than what was directed to renewable energy. And most of this is expected to be stranded assets. One study said about 71% of projected oil and gas projects on the continent would become stranded assets. And it's also killing us prematurely. 1 in 5 deaths every single year in the world are coming from fossil fuel driven air pollution. So And here you can see a visual of how much our continent is being carved up for fossil fuel extraction. This is from the Fossil Fuel Atlas that our partners at PowerShift Africa have been leading. And we think, why is all this devastation and fossil fuel plunder happening on the continent with the highest renewable energy potential in the world? I know some of our speakers are going to dive into this further, but it's 39% of the entire world's renewable energy potential is located in Africa. 60% of the world's best solar resources, the wind capacity on the continent could power the continent's energy needs 250 times over. So we have to really shift to this paradigm that can actually deliver our development needs. It means renewable energy can mean affordable and abundant clean energy for the continent. More jobs can be created from renewable energy investments, 2 to 5 times more jobs from renewable energy investment than compared to fossil fuels. So how do we make this happen? We need international cooperation and we need global justice and equity. I said before that the Paris Agreement has a massive omission. Fossil fuels is not mentioned once. We saw it creeping its way in at COP26 in Glasgow, which is 26 years too late, to see weakened language around unabated coal and inefficient subsidies. So we're really pushing forward the fossil fuel treaty as a complementary mechanism to the Paris Agreement. And it's already garnering support from nation states around the world, which I'm going to get into in a second. There's 3 pillars that ground the fossil fuel treaty. There's one around a just transition. So that is actually ensuring that there's economic and technical support for fossil fuel dependent developing nations, such as in Africa, to transition away and have that technical and financial support to harness the renewable energy potential that they have. And support economic diversification and development alternatives. There's the pillar on non-proliferation, so no new expansion of fossil fuels anywhere in the world, because you saw before, already the projects that are underway overshoot our carbon budget. There can be no new fossil fuel projects anywhere, and we hope to support the site fights and finance campaigns that are working to kind of reduce the social license of the fossil fuel industry and make sure no new projects come on board. And there's a pillar around a fair phase out. So this means, like I was saying before, Canada, the US, Norway, Australia, etc., need to phase out their production of fossil fuels first and fastest and support the most dependent among us that are intertwined with the fossil economy that have not created the crisis, to make sure there's support in winding down that production and opening up pathways to renewable energy. Already there's been support from thousands of civil society organizations around the world, more than 3,000 scientists, academics, and researchers. There's been hundreds of parliamentarians, 101 Nobel laureates, nearly 100 cities and subnational governments around the world, more than 2,000 youth activists and leaders. There's been thousands of health professionals, including the World Health Organization, as well as thousands of faith leaders. And as I was saying before, there's now 8 nation states that are leading the call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, including fossil fuel producers that recognize the need to diversify their economies and bring about a renewable energy era. And we want the same momentum to continue on the African continent, which is why we're also connecting with all of you today, because we know the role of journalism and African voices in propelling this transition is super necessary. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and just invite our other speakers to contribute. So the first speaker that we have now is Omar El-Mawi. And Omar is a dedicated Pan-African lawyer who co-convenes the Africa Movement Building Space, which is a platform pushing for a Pan-African approach towards resolving the continent's problems. He has dedicated his career towards working with communities and the African people to reject harmful projects like coal in Kenya through the Decolonize campaign, and also oil extraction in East Africa through the Stop East Africa Crude Oil Pipeline, or Stop EACOP. So Omar, I wanted to ask you, there have been key moments on fossil fuels and renewable energy for the continent in the lead up to COP28. We've seen the inaugural Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi in September that was contested by the Real Africa Climate Summit, and then followed up by both the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF in Marrakesh, and Africa Energy Week in Cape Town last month. So I wanted to ask if you can speak about the key outcomes from these key summits for the climate justice movement across the continent and the key demands that have come forth as a result for COP28.
Thanks, my sister and friend Seble, first for eloquently speaking on the treaty and also giving a very good background on Africa and the many tragedies that we're facing, despite having a lot of blessings and resources for us to be transitioning towards a system and a process that's going to benefit a majority of the Africans and not a few of our elected representatives that are sort of making decisions and only thinking about their stomachs and their immediate loved ones. Before I go to that, I just wanted to take a minute and quickly, mention that, Seble had talked about a continent that has over 600 million people that are energy poor. And this has been used significantly as the justification towards pushing for fossil fuel extraction, where we're being told that we need to extract so that we can provide the much needed energy for these 600 million people that don't have access to energy, for the over 1 billion people that are still, almost 1 billion people that are being affected and they don't have access to clean cooking because in Africa, more people die out of indoor pollution or because of indoor pollution than people who are dying out of HIV/AIDS, which means it's a major tragedy and something that we need to think about in terms of resolving it. This thing which I've seen happening a lot within our media is how we are endorsing and utilizing the arguments that we are seeing from the global north and how global north has developed because of fossil fuels and bringing the same arguments to the global south and Africa in this case. But what we are forgetting is the fact that a majority of the fossil fuel explorations and exploitation that's happening within the continent are majorly for export. So they're very neo-colonial in nature. If you talk about the East African crude oil pipeline, if you talk about what's happening in Mozambique, in Namibia, and all parts of areas that are fossil fuel exploration and exploitation, you will see that it's actually for export, either to Europe or to the East or to the US. And Seble did put in a map that really spoke and shown some of these many pipelines that are doing this. So the question to me then is, how does the continent progress forward in a way that we are providing this energy for the people who don't have access to it? Because it's not just about cutting emissions, because we don't even have the energy that we need to transition from. It's about avoiding the emissions altogether. So how do we come up with a model that is providing development, energy, and also dealing with the climate crisis in a way that we are not digging deeper into the climate crisis hole that we are currently in? Now, diving to the question that we've asked, I was asked to comment about the three important key African and global meetings that have happened. One is the Africa Climate Summit 2023, the first ever summit that brought or supposedly brought African countries into the discussion around climate issues. The second one is the World Bank and the IMF meetings that were happening in Marrakech, in Morocco, which are also significantly important. And the last one is the Africa Energy Climate Week, which happened in Cape Town, just a month or barely a month back. Now, to start with the Africa Climate Summit, I want to be clear that as an African and someone who's a Pan-African and really thinking about how this continent can progress and can benefit from our elected representatives, is that when I had it being announced in the last COP, which was in Sharm el-Sheikh last year in Egypt, our president announced that they're going to be calling for the first Africa Climate, to be bringing African leaders onto the table, and we're going to be making decisions about how a continent that has contributed the least to the climate crisis can first contribute towards dealing and tackling the climate crisis itself, but also come up with a solution so that it's not just about complaining and talking about how we are victims, which indeed we are, but also how do we come up with solutions. So first ever meeting happening in Nairobi, thousands of civil society and people all over the continent came. But one thing that was really a letdown from the summit was and this is something that we keep telling people every day. They overpromised. They told us that they're going to be dealing with food sovereignty, they're going to be dealing with the climate crisis, they're going to be coming in with solutions, but then they really under-delivered. And I'm not necessarily blowing things out of proportion, because if that summit could be wrapped up in terms of what we've decided, is really about false solutions and about financing. And the financing itself, it's talking about geoengineering It's talking about carbon credits, which are in essence just pollution permits, where we're actually giving a blank check for the polluters to continue polluting at the source in the Western and the global North, as Africa is giving territory, is giving land, is displacing communities so that these people can continue exploiting these resources. The second thing is the fact that, as it was termed as an Africa Climate Summit, only 30% of the African nations were actually represented within the summit. Only 17 countries attended. Key countries and important countries like Nigeria, Uganda, our neighbor, South Africa did not turn up for this meeting. So 70% of African nations did not turn up for the summit. And this should be a major question for all of us, because what it means is that it's not an African climate summit, because it doesn't bring the whole Africa, it actually brings 30% of the people who attended. And I haven't even gone into these 30% that have attended. A majority of them felt that what they had come to discuss was not necessarily what was decided. The only good thing that came from the summit, if I could mention, is the few finances that were announced, but they're very small, minute financing that's coming, like someone like the US, I think they announced that around $30 million to be given to African nations. That's like 500,000 USD per country if you divide it by 54, 55 countries in Africa. And to me, that's less money than even a medium civil society organization raises within a year. So if a country decides that their part that they have to play within their portion that they've contributed to the climate crisis is only giving each country 500,000 USD, it's really not necessarily taking this issue seriously. The only good thing and that I would mention happened within the summit is really the parallel real Africa Climate Summit that was organized by civil society organization within the whole continent. And big things happened. I mean, I'm sure the journalists here, you saw and you attended and actually reported on thousands of people coming to the streets to protest and march from Nyayo Stadium in Nairobi all the way towards the central business district in Nairobi, sort of convene and sort of share and project their voices in what they need to see coming out from the climate summit. There was a people's declaration that was decided. I don't have time to speak too much about it, but I'll share the link here and people can look at it and know more about it. But it was very Pan-African. It was really thinking about how the continent can improve as a continent and not necessarily each of us thinking ourselves as independent and only and nations, selfishly thinking as countries, and many, many other good things that happened. As Seble had mentioned, the Paris Agreement, much as it's one of the cornerstones for climate action or climate recognition, the crisis recognition that's happening today, it failed to mention the fossil fuels. And the same happened in the Africa Climate Summit. I mean, they didn't speak about oil and gas, as contributors to the climate crisis. And to me, if you go to the hospital and you're sick, it's not enough, and you have a serious ailment, you have a cancer, and the doctor is only giving you painkillers to treat the cancer that you have. It's not a way of dealing with this situation and the disease that you have. What we need here is serious chemotherapy. We need to seriously think about phasing out of fossil fuels and thinking about the treaty as Seble had talked about. I mean, quickly talking about the World Bank Group meetings, the same. I mean, and as Africans, I don't expect much of Africa to benefit from these Bretton Woods institutions because all of us know that they were instituted long before Africa as a continent got independence from colonialism. And therefore, whatever these institutions were founded to do, it won't be in the best interest of Africa because we were not there to bargain from the front in terms of how that would look like. And therefore, that's why we've seen the World Bank and the IMF have always been pushing for the global North interest. And that's how you're seeing a lot of the many problems that we're facing within the continent, not just from the climate, but also the debt crisis and how the financial and the financial architecture is sort of planned and situated. Lorraine will tell you that she was in Marrakech during the meetings. She had a petition that she wanted to deliver to the World Bank president, who refused to accept that petition because we were talking about how Africa should not be utilizing gas as a transition fuel, but actually be talking about renewable energy that we have a lot of potential of. It's cheaper, and we don't have to worry about the many problems that fossil fuels come with. And then finally, I mean, the Africa Energy Week, same story. I mean, people who are behind it, the Africa Energy Chamber, people who we know have been very much in support of fossil fuels within the continent. If anything, they've been the Nobel laureates of fossil fuel gospel within the continent. And therefore, we saw the discussion being discussed about, gas in Equatorial Guinea, how Uganda can benefit from their oil, how Nigeria can continue to benefit from their oil, which in real sense, they're not necessarily benefiting, because if there's a country that has the highest number of people living in poverty, Nigeria in Africa is one of them. Actually, at some point, it even took over India, and it was one of the countries that has the most people living in poverty. Last, I mean, we are moving towards COP, and we've complained for the past 57 years when people have taken their holidays and going to these amazing cities in the name of attending climate negotiations, but actually going there for shopping or with their loved ones or sightseeing or whatever, allowances and stuff, while the rest of the common good is being affected, and they're not necessarily thinking about the importance of the world. So in the place of Africa, I'd mention that it's the demands that you're pushing out is, one, we have to hit the nail on the head. Is that what they say in terms of, if we are actually talking about climate change, we want to deal with the climate crisis, then we have to deal with, for the past decade, 86% of the emissions that are coming, the carbon emissions that are in the air, have came from fossil fuels. We're talking about oil, gas, and coal. And therefore, we need, at least for the first time, to recognize and mention and accept that actually we are in this crisis. We are in this problem because of our greed towards exploiting more than we need within our resources that we have, and that we are not looking at how we can exploit and utilize alternative methods like renewable energy that is community-driven, that is less harmful without any health impacts, and also it's cheaper and creates more jobs opportunities. I think another demand, and Sebele, you've mentioned this, would be the importance of us really starting to talk about a treaty that will be deciding for us, or making the roadmap of how we transition or phase out from the fossil fuel curse that we're actually currently engrossed in. And this is important. So you can call it whatever you want, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty or whatever, and I don't think we're here because we want it to be named in a certain manner. What we want to be seen is that treaty actually talks about a roadmap of how we've transitioned beyond oil and gas. I think another demand that's really important is on the alternative, because I mentioned it's not just enough to cut on fossil fuels. We also have to provide energy for the 600 million energy poor people within Africa. We have to provide clean cooking. And when I say clean cooking, I don't mean gas, I mean electric cooking for over almost 1 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking. So we have to scale up renewable energy. And the fun fact here is, between 2010 and 2020, a whole 10 years, Africa only received about $55 billion of investment in renewable energy. And while that might look like a big number, it's really a disgrace, because the total amount of investment that went out to renewable energy is 2.25 trillion. And it means Africa only received less than 3% of the global financing that has been going towards renewable energy. And this is a continent that Sebele has told you almost 60% of the solar capacity potential is available within the continent. How we have over 40% of the strategic minerals that we need for renewable energy, and all that. So why are we not getting enough money and resources financed here? And then finally, is also when we look at climate, we cannot look at it on a hypothetical level. We have to look at it in terms of how it affects the other factors that we have within the continent, and how the financial model is currently instituted. It's really quite detrimental to Africa because it's contributed towards a debt crisis, because African countries keep borrowing and borrowing more money to try and sort of align with how the current model is situated. If you look at the loans that are given to Africa, the interest is 6 to 7 times more than if they were being given to the Western countries or to Europe and stuff like that. So we have to be equal in terms of how we're providing these investments and not necessarily affecting people so much. And then finally, and I'm mentioning finally because I know I've mentioned it severally, but I'm actually doing this finally severally. We really have to look at how fossil fuel has affected people significantly in terms of, people have died, people have been arrested, people have been detained, families, have been relocated, families have been displaced. How do we provide restorative justice to these people? Because the big fossil fuel companies have benefited from this chaos, and it will be unjust and an injustice if we do not look at the historic and current infractions that people have had to live with because of fossil fuel extraction. I'll stop there, Seble, and hand it back over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Omar. It was really helpful to see the panorama of the last few months, sort of the capture of some of these major summits and the way civil society itself has had to kind of retake them back and formulate them in our own demands, such as the Real Africa Climate Summit with people-centered demands for an energy transition, agroecology, etc. And also some of the demands at the lead up and during COP28 around complete fossil fuel phase out, investment in alternatives and scaling renewable energy and increased financing, shifting finance from fossil fuels to renewable energy, getting a pathway to this transition, such as through a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and also ensuring there's reparations and restorative justice for all those who have been criminalized and experienced violence and displacement from the fossil fuel industry. So thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful overview, Omar. And our next speaker now is Lorraine Chiponda. Lorraine has been in the climate justice space for nearly a decade, having engaged as an activist, a community rights defender, a regional climate and energy facilitator, and now embarks on a role under the Africa Movement Building Spaces, the Africa Facilitator. And in this role, Lorraine works with a broad spectrum of African civil society organizations and groups, creating a collaborative space that facilitates collaboration among their intersections, as well as being a co-facilitator for Don't Gas Africa. So welcome, Lorraine. So for you, I wanted to ask how can international, wrong question. Okay, can you please explain and allude a bit more to what I had spoke about at the beginning and also Omar had spoke about this fossil fueled fallacy? We've heard in both political discourse and public rhetoric that fossil fuels are positioned as the only pathway to development, including the framing that Omar was speaking to of gas as a transition fuel. So could you please explain why this is in fact a fossil fueled fallacy and what is the role of the media in dispelling this myth?
Thank you very much, Seble, and everyone else who is here. So just to start, I'm going to talk about the historical background of fossil fuels in Africa and how they came about, and why after so many years of Africa investing in fossil fuel, Africa still has not developed. Africa still has 1 billion people that don't have access to clean cooking. And still, after so many years of hosting fossil fuel projects, Africa has 600 million people living in energy poverty. So the fossil fuel legacy in Africa has been marked by colonialism. That is how we experienced fossil fuel exploration in Africa, right? Fossil fuel has been extractive. If we look at the many communities across Africa that have hosted fossil fuel projects, you will see that a lot of them have got externalized costs by fossil corporations. If we look at the Niger Delta, where oil has been drilled, gas has been drilled, you see how communities are devastated by those impacts. Just recently, Mother Earth Foundation released a video which shows Shell's wells that have been burning for the past 3 years. And we're talking about the role of media. The media has not managed to expose such externalities, such impacts by Shell, a large corporation that is in the aware on the community. And this is something that media should be picking up on and challenging corporations and fossil fuel companies on their operations in Africa, particularly given the messages that they show out to the world and back where their headquarters in Europe, that they are, providing jobs for people. And yet where they are hosted, such projects, are not really working for people. Fossil fuel projects have also carried with them racism. They've also carried with them energy apartheid. If you look at how the fossil fuel infrastructure itself is structured, you see that many of the communities across Africa are excluded from accessing energy because the fossil fuel infrastructure was placed in urban areas to feed, well, largely the white population, the white settler population. And also it was laid out in a structure where much of it is for export, right? You know that Africa has got countries that produce oil and gas, and much of it is not for local consumption, but it is for export. I'll give an example of the South Africa Highveld, where there is massive coal exploration there. You find that the Black community is the one that is breathing in the fumes, right, of coal projects in the Mpumalanga province. And globally, if you look at the level of air pollution, it is actually one of the regions across the globe that experiences the highest level of air pollution. Yet we are finding that community has got Black people living in such areas. So now building up to what we have now, the Dash for Gas in Africa, right? We know that it was as a response of the energy crisis in Europe. And of course, our African leaders, right, felt that they could benefit from the short-term increase in prices. And then, of course, because of the global political landscape, they felt that, okay, they had to support European countries, especially that were coming to Africa to exploit for gas. So from the map that you have showed earlier on, which shows the layout of gas projects across Africa, much of them, if you look at them, are in coastal areas, and much of them are building massive ports that are taking out the energy out of Africa. So it is a fallacy that fossil fuel industry will benefit local people. We know the political economy of the fossil industry that is based on primitive accumulations, which means, like I said earlier on, it is extractive, it is export oriented, and it has got rent-seeking behaviors whereby host communities and even the countries themselves don't see any meaningful benefit. I'll give another example that is happening in Mozambique. The Dash for Gas, I should say, has managed to convince more than 8 countries that have never experienced fossil fuel extraction in Africa to start investing in gas exploration recently. And amongst these, we are seeing Mozambique. And from Mozambique, there are countries from Europe, such as Italy, such as Eni, that are exploiting gas in Mozambique. If you look at the landscape in Mozambique, it is a country that has got a democracy that is still developing. It's not yet at the level that is required, 1. 2, Mozambique, especially in the Cabo Delgado, is experiencing a lot of conflict because of rebel groups in that region. And one example I will give that happened in 2021 when there was a terrorist attack in the Palma village. You find that the government and Total released 800 soldiers that ran off to protect Total's infrastructure. So rather than protecting communities, protecting women and children that were facing the threat of rebel groups, fossil fuel corporations went on to protect their facilities. They didn't even care to protect their own workers, right, that they contract, the contract workers. They were not even protected. So again, that's why we're seeing a lawsuit that has been launched against Total Energies because of this. And this is the legacy that we have in Africa of the fossil fuel industry. And so fossil fuel industry is not going to develop Africa. They don't care that Africa has got conflict. They don't care that Africa has got energy poverty or it is impacted by the climate crisis, right? We all know that the climate crisis is as a result of the same fossil fuel corporations that have been extracting fossils, and gas is no exception. Gas will still increase carbon emissions, will still increase greenhouse gas emissions, which result in global warming, which is causing the climate crisis. And Africa is the most affected, despite contributing very little towards the climate crisis. So again, this alone shows that the fossil fuel industry, gas, will not support meaningful development for Africa. I want to come back to another issue that I wanted to talk about the ownership of the fossil fuel projects in Africa. If you look at who owns the fossil projects, you find that most of them are companies that are foreign. So which means they're expatriating the profits away from Africa, and they are not really going to benefit. The statistics show that less than 33% is owned by or controlled by African corporations and governments included. So which means a large chunk, the rest of the 60-something% is owned by foreign corporations who are taking away the profits. Let's look at the situation that is happening in Senegal, where Senegal has never really exploited fossil fuels, and now they've got Shell, which is exploiting gas in the Mauritania. First, we saw land rights issues whereby the fisher community was displaced from the coastal areas and displaced from their livelihoods, which in turn affects food nutrition and household nutrition, right? It also affects the livelihood income. And the fishermen cannot get any jobs from the fossil corporations because they don't have that. It's not their expertise, right? If you want to promote African people to develop and thrive, it means we have to support our alternative livelihoods, support our way of life, and ensure that our ecosystem, our environment is protected so that we can attain our livelihoods, right? So again, fossil fuels are not the way. So when you now again go to the role of social media and how they should, support development alternatives and the transition in Africa, media has got the responsibility to build people's consciousness and to build awareness amongst people, right? I've talked about the climate crisis. I've talked about rent-seeking behaviors, the primitive accumulation by fossil corporations in Africa. The media has got a role to expose these information, build a collective awareness amongst African communities affected by the climate crisis, going into Mozambique, talking about how the Mozambique has been affected by a cyclone Idai consecutively for the past by various cyclones, including cyclone Idai, for the past 3 years, talking about how Malawi has been affected by floods, Nigeria is affected by floods, the ongoing Shell inferno that has been burning for the past 3 years, thereby affecting surrounding communities, talking about real critical issues that are often ignored by business people that allow business people to perpetuate land rights issues in African communities. And once we build the collective consciousness and people are able to make the connection between how we have been disenfranchised by the climate crisis, it means then we can resist fossil fuel extraction in Africa, provide alternative mechanisms for development. Another way that media is supposed to support transition issues in Africa is by exposing development traps, right? So development traps in Africa are development models that don't support African people to thrive, that don't support the aspirations of the ordinary person or to thrive. So one of them is the Dash for Gas in Africa. I've talked about the impacts of the Dash for Gas. Omar has mentioned the impacts of the Dash for Gas. And so media should be able to, like I said, build the collective consciousness by exposing development traps. We all know how trade is even skewed in Africa. We know that Africa does not benefit from the global economic infrastructure. Just to give a statistic, with regards to escalation of renewable energy, we know that Africa is only getting 2% of the global finance that is available for renewable energy. Media should be exposing such discrepancies and help dismantle forces that don't allow African communities to thrive. So media has got a very critical role, particularly providing alternative propositions, sharing stories and amplifying community voices and story, so that impacts that happen in Africa that are caused by fossil corporations and by corporations that are not in Africa reach the recipients of the products, whether it's oil that is coming from Africa. Recipients in Europe, the public in Europe should be aware that that fossil fuel is coming from a community that is impacted. Once we build that consciousness, it means we can then push for meaningful, just transition away from fossil fuels. Thank you very much, Sible. I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. I was so hooked on everything you were saying. And I think yeah, you've explained so well. And obviously it's terrible to hear everything, all the destruction you're recounting, how much the communities that actually have fossil fuels have turned into sacrifice zones, and the amount of dispossession, violence, and destruction that's happening in these areas that are not even profiting from energy access, because most of it is foreign owned and shipped away, and how much, for example, the dash for gas in Africa was a response to the European energy crisis, nothing to do with Africa's energy needs. So thank you so much for spelling out so much of the destruction that's been happening from the fossil fuel industry on the continent, and the pathways that we have through the media to amplify these truths and make sure they're heard everywhere, and to tap into pathways for renewable energy to actually reach these communities to have power, the 600 million without power and the nearly 1 billion without clean cooking. So thank you so much. We're running a bit over time, so I hope some of you can stay and listen. Can you please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and stay hopefully another 10 extra minutes so that we can engage with everyone. I want to now go to our last speaker before we open up for questions, who is Dean Bekumuzi Bebe. Dean is a PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand and a 2018 Mandela Rhodes Scholar with several years' experience building and implementing campaign strategies across Africa. So I think now we've heard from Lorraine so much about this fossil fallacy. I wanted to ask Dean if you could let us know how, instead of feeding into this fossil fueled fallacy, governments can seize the largely untapped renewable energy potential in Africa, which is the highest in the world, and how can international cooperation via a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that is grounded in global justice and equity facilitate Africa's deployment of renewable energy for all, meeting the continent's development, economic, health, and education needs, and how can the media support this narrative and this momentum?
Thank you, Sible, and thanks everyone. Apologies, my camera will be off because I'm part of the 600 million people without energy access at the moment. But, you know, the current reliance on fossil fuels in Africa poses significant threats to global climate stability, the health and well-being of the African populations, as my previous speakers have mentioned, and the continent's, you know, long-term sustainable development pathway. And this is really anchored in the principles of climate justice and equity. You know, this is really a meticulous examination of Africa's transition from fossil fuels, which really unveils the multifaceted nature and implications for sustainable development and the global climate discourse. You know, however, amidst of all this wave of agreements and speculative investments and the enthusiasm really of African nations to amplify fossil fuel production, apprehensions arise. And critics argue that this fervent chase for gas on the continent could be perilous and myopic, in the sense that intensifying fossil gas operations in Africa might wreak havoc on the economic system. And this has really been lovely articulated by Lorraine, and really essentially the touted merits of fossil gas as a relatively cleaner transition fuel are frequently overemphasized and misrepresented. And this comes our opportunity, because in our hands lies the power to shape not just our present, but the legacy we leave for our future generations. So we stand at a pivotal crossroads in human history as we look ahead to COP28, where our decisions can either lead to continued environmental degradation or alternatively, and that's the alternative that we're looking for, rejuvenated sustainability. And the proposal for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to seize fossil fuel use is more than just a policy initiative. It's a clarion call for transformative change, a plea rather to embrace a future that respects and preserves our planet. Because the science is undeniable. Our reliance on fossil fuels is the primary driver of climate change, responsible for rising temperatures, devastating natural disasters, and an unprecedented ecological destruction. And each year we delay the action, the consequences grow more severe, and the window for change narrows. So a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to end fossil fuel use is not a choice. It is an imperative and necessary step to avert a climate catastrophe. And the treaty is not just an environmental necessity, but also a matter of global justice and equity. The burdens of climate change fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable and often those who've contributed least to the problem. On that backdrop, by transitioning away from fossil fuels, we can instead forge a path that is not only sustainable, but also equitable, ensuring all nations, especially those in the developing world, and across the board have a fair chance to grow and prosper. And contrary to the narrative of economic sacrifice, moving away from fossil fuels opens up realms of many possibilities. The renewable energy sector is ripe with opportunities for job creation, innovation, economic growth. I always like to use this example that, when we're looking at Africa, we're such a water-stressed continent. And if you look at how much water it takes to make 1 megawatt of electricity per hour, for example, if you're going to use that using coal, for example, you're using 1,476 liters of water in comparison to the 25 liters that you use to produce electricity using solar energy. So this treaty can really be a catalyst for a new green economic revolution, redefining how we understand our energy systems and how that can be empowering and unlocking developmental pathways while creating a sustainable model for development that benefits everyone across the board. And the impact on public health cannot be overstated because fossil fuels are a major source of air pollution, responsible for millions of premature deaths annually. Currently, right now, the World Health Organization pegs that at over $3 trillion is being used every year to treat air pollution-related diseases. So by ending our dependence on these fossil fuels, we pave a way for cleaner air, healthier communities, and a significant reduction in healthcare costs. But as we transition through this, as we try to leapfrog towards renewable energy, we must understand that Africa is not trying to manage emissions. We are trying to avoid emissions, which is why it's very important to understand what does an equitable phase out look like. Ideas like systems change, which means building a new energy system, not simply trying to fix the parts of the existing fossil fuel dependent ones, which only creates and deepens other crises. We need to think around energy as a common good, where everyone should have the right to energy, and energy should not be treated as a commodity. The sun and the wind are shared resources with a value beyond the market itself. We need to think around energy sufficiency for all. Access to energy must be recognized as a basic human right and a necessary condition of a dignified life. Sufficient energy is essential for education and employment opportunities, as previously mentioned. We also have to think about financing for the energy revolutions. Rich countries in the global north must provide the finance based on that enormous historical responsibility for climate change. And how do we also envision this through the lens of renewable energy for all? Renewable energy means healthier people, cleaner air, soil, and water, and helping to end the ecosystem and habitat destruction that uncovers dangerous pathogens. We also have to understand how do we center renewable energy technology that is climate resilient, locally appropriate, and low impact. Because the fastest and first way to shift to 100% renewable energy is to prioritize technology that is as small scale and decentralized as it is practicable. We also have to understand the idea around energy sovereignty and energy democracy. To demand energy sovereignty is to demand that our energy systems are under the control and the ownership of the people, thus unlocking a just transition that protects the rights of the energy sector workers and even the communities and their livelihoods. And at this, we have the people at the center, allowing them to flourish, and those obstacles to progress are removed. People everywhere are ready and eager across the African continent to take control of the energy systems. Imagine a world where clean energy lights up our homes, powers our industries, and drives our vehicles. A world where we live in harmony with nature, preserving its wonders for our children and their children as well. And this is the world we are trying to create as we look ahead to COP28. Driving force being the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's a vision not just for survival, but of flourishing, a testament of human ingenuity and our unyielding commitment to a better future. In conclusion, the global call for a treaty to cease the use of fossil fuels is a call to action, to responsibility, and to hope. It is an invitation to join hands in shaping a sustainable, equitable, prosperous future for all. And I urge you all for us to really seize this moment and come with courage and determination, for the stakes have never been higher and the rewards have never been greater. And I would like to also finally just touch base on the role of media in supporting the narrative and the momentum, because media does play a crucial role in educating the public about the importance of transitioning to renewable energy. But as we transition to renewable energy, the narrative that gas has an important role to play within the emerging new energy mix is a false solution. And that is a dangerous, short-sighted ambition. Again, there's the narrative around African carbon markets, which essentially provides licenses for the polluting countries to continue polluting. And I'm not for popular, culture references, but it's giving colonialism at the end of the day, because already we've got 2 African countries who've surrendered their land to these polluting countries. Over 20% of African land, in the East African region, really largely, has been surrendered to these polluting countries. And in Kenya recently, a huge tribe was driven away with little or no compensation. And these are the stories that need to be reported. And media needs to showcase these atrocities and at the same time showcase the successful renewable energy initiatives that are happening in Africa, that are also said to happen and being proposed to happen, highlighting the benefits and encouraging investment and support. And there's also a role around advocacy and accountability. The media can also serve as a platform for advocacy, pushing for policy changes and holding government bodies and international bodies accountable for their commitment to sustainable energy and climate goals is very important. Thank you very much. Back to you, Seble.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I don't think I can summarize it any better than you've put it about the treaty as an imperative and all the kind of benefits that we can get from this transition, and naming energy as it is as a basic human right, and the opportunities that come once we are able to harness energy sovereignty, energy of the people, energy democracy, and the need for systems change, and putting power and energy in the hands of the people, and moving away from this economic sacrifice and the sacrifice zones that Lorraine had also spoken to have this sort of transformative vision and a call to action for a new world that is powered by different energy systems, renewable energy systems that are in the hands of the people. I think now we've gone a bit over time, but we want to make space for any questions that you may have. If you are able to unmute, feel free to ask any question that you have. And if you are not able to, feel free to just put any question that you have into the chat. Just give a few moments.
We have a question in the chat, Seble. Several
Oh,
questions,
I
actually.
missed it.
Several questions, like 3 questions. So maybe we can ask, several questions.
Okay, I see Rosemary's question first.
First,
Is
yeah,
that-
but there is a comment from Rosemary, and then we have
Okay.
questions in the chat.
Rosemary has said, I would challenge organizations such as the Fossil Fuel Treaty to work closely with journalists in Africa by supporting us to go down to the affected communities and voice their stories, because they are vulnerable and powerless. The governments have colluded with fossil fuel industries. And maybe we can share that there will be a film screening about some of these affected communities during COP28 that maybe, I don't know, Dean, if you want to speak, do you want to mention anything about the documentary screening at COP?
Yeah, sure. We'll be screening the Don't Gas Africa Shifting Power documentary, which captures fossil fuel journey in 5 African countries: Kenya, Uganda, Cameroon, Senegal, and Nigeria, on the 2nd of December at the Climate Justice Pavilion. If you do want to look for more information around that, please check out our socials as from next week on Twitter at Don't Gas Africa or at Fossil Fuel Treaty. Thanks. Back to you, Seble.
Thank you, Dean. I'm seeing a question from David around grants and for journalists doing stories, we don't currently have budget to offer grants, but we can make connections with some of these communities that you're interested in covering, as Rosemary had asked. There's a question from Arnold. 3 questions from Arnold. Okay, 1, given the present limited financial support and investment in clean energy across Africa, is it feasible for the continent to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy? That's 1 question. 2, Africa relies heavily on external funding. What steps can be taken to reverse this dependence? Without self-sufficiency, achieving a smooth transition is impossible. And 3, what prompts Africa to serve as a repository for carbon credits, enduring the consequences of the Global North's actions and enabling their ongoing exploration of fossil fuels? So those are 3 questions. This first 2, speaking especially about financing. Lorraine, Omar, and Dean, which of you would like to take this question?
I can
Okay.
go. I can take question 2 for a little bit. So indeed, you're right. Africa relies heavily on external funding. And in typing that, you've to a large extent answered yourself, because that in itself is a problem. Why should a continent that is rich in natural resources be stuck in a cycle of need, want, and fear? And the way I would answer that in terms of steps to be taken to reverse this dependence is really the buzz term right now, which is the new global financial architecture. Now, the problem with that is it acknowledges a need for change and more money needs to start coming into African countries. But at the same time, once we look at the operationalization of the new global financial architecture reform that's been proposed, we still have the same systems that have plunged us into the very same structural traps as African countries detecting our economic activity. By that, I mean the World Bank is the steward for most grants and loans coming into Africa. Now, the World Bank was created through the Bretton Woods system. And I'm answering this because the steps that need to be taken would be to decolonize the World Bank. And I mean in that instance, because in 1945, when the Bretton Woods system was proposed, there were no African countries present, meaning that this economic activity was drafted at a moment where colonialism and inequality was rife within Africa. And we have allowed that Bretton Woods system to even metamorphosize into the 21st century. And that is the big problem. We are allowing something that was created during colonialism and inequality to perpetuate inequality, rather, to be operationalized in the 21st century, where there isn't any colonialism, where there isn't any inequality. And that is the root problem. And we need to really take steps in addressing those underlying issues in order for us to unlock the finance that we need as a continent, because there are systematic traps. No matter what methodology you provide, no matter how fantastic it will be, if you do not address that systematic cause that was initiated in 1945, we will fail as the African continent, which is why at the end of the day, we are caught in this cycle where we are purchasing products using a currency that we do not trade in. And then we buy it back either as a finished product at a higher cost. But remember, we're buying it back in United States dollars and we don't trade in that. The stock market fluctuates every day. That means that we're not even buying it at a good rate. So we're not even breaking even. That means as we're buying it, we're also buying debt. And in order for us to subsidize for the loss, we borrow again. And then in order for us to try and prepay that loan again, we export more products. And in order for us to then gain finished products again, we're caught in that cycle where again, we do not have enough money. So this is the systematic trap that I'm trying to really explain that we need to address if we are to build a mindful global financial architecture where Africa can tap into the necessary resources to leapfrog towards renewable energy. Thanks, Sablet.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I think it's, really important to relay how much the financial systems that we're still entrenched in were created in times of colonialism, and also the examples that you've given today, which I think is a good transition to the other question around carbon credits, is how much we continue to be entrenched in these colonial systems to this day, with many African countries giving away vast swaths of their land for these carbon credits, also known as pollution permits. So I think, Omar, you wanted to take it away with that question from Arnold around carbon credits.
I mean, definitely, and it's a really good question, Arnold, because if it's as bad as we're claiming it is, then why is it still happening? And you, as someone from the media, and the majority of you from the media, you definitely know better than me that many at times our governments are not necessarily driven by common sense, but by other factors. And this is one of those scenarios where they're looking at the small, minute monies that they're going to be getting out of the supposedly carbon credits, and giving in its place important resources, giving land, and also locking themselves in from developing as nations. And it's really significant. If anyone is benefiting from carbon credits, there are two people. First ones are the fossil fuel companies, because they are continuing to say that, and mention that they have taken climate action, and therefore they can continue polluting because they are in some ways dealing away or subtracting whatever they are polluting with these nations. And therefore it's stopping these countries from developing as countries, and the other winners are going to be the brokers who are involved in the system. Look at it the same way as you're seeing how the trade and securities systems happen, where the brokers, are like what you're seeing in Wall Street and the London Exchange, how people are making money out of the whole of that process. So countries, developing countries, in this case Africa, is giving land. Dean has told you that over 20% of the land in East Africa is given away. Communities are being displaced. They're told that they cannot continue with their way of living, their livelihoods, and living within their ancestral homes, and they're being foreclosed from these areas so that the country can be getting a few millions, to mention this. So the only reason why they're doing this is to get the money, which becomes, there's no way of following and knowing how that money has been utilized. So it's right money, that it's the best money for corruption. If you're a corrupt person, this is the best place you'll go to, because there's no one to ask you questions. You've already done a business, you've gotten the money, and no one can ask questions in terms of how that money has been utilized and where it has gone to. So it's the best way. But then also finally is the financial architecture that we have within our continent. African countries have been borrowing too much, and therefore they're in a debt crisis. They have to borrow to keep paying for their debts. And therefore they're looking at every other avenue that they can get this money to continue paying and sort of maintaining some of those loans that they've actually gotten. So it's not necessarily because they want the continent to benefit or to improve the continent, but it's only because of a short-sighted and myopic and also selfish reasons why they're doing this for their own benefit, so to speak.
Thank you so much, Omar.
And Seble, sorry, I forgot to mention, there's a report that PowerShip has done around carbon markets. For anyone who's interested, I'll share the link, which talks about the Africa Carbon Markets, which is an initiative, which is a wolf dressed in sheepskin. So I will share that if anyone wants to read more around it as well.
Yeah, I think that would be wonderful, Omar, if you can share that in the chat. Also, if we can share the fossil fuel fallacy report, that would be wonderful. And Viviana, if you're able, if you could just put the link to the COP events also into the chat for any of the journalists that will be at COP if they want to attend any of the events that we are our partners are organizing.
Sharing the link.
And if you could also please put your email, Viviana, in the chat, because we're wrapping up the session today. I think it's been really powerful how Omar, Lorraine, and Dean, you're all able to show us just how much this fossil fuel fallacy has been entrenched across the continent, this blind sort of following of the fossil fuel industry as it has led us to plunder and to violence and to energy poverty. And actually what needs to take place is this people-powered transition with distributed energy to actually fulfill our energy needs and our education and health and development needs, instead of going further into this path that has taken away our air quality and taken away our chance of living kind of fulfilling lives with consistent energy access. We've instead been following a pathway that has not delivered on these goals. And we have so much possibility with our renewable energy potential that can be harnessed with a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I thank all of you so much for being here. It's been super enlightening for me, and I think everyone who's joined. And if you have any more questions to any of the journalists attending, Viviana has put her email in the chat. She's our communications campaign manager, so feel free to follow up there and stay connected. We've put many of the resources available. The Africa Carbon Markets Initiative, Omar has put in, and also the fossil fuel fallacy report that was prepared by Don't Gas Africa. So we want to stay connected with all of you. Thank you so much for staying and going over time with us today. And we hope we can see you all at COP28 and continue this conversation.